Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends from Hungary, United States, Europe, across the globe, from across the globe. I'm afraid my speech will be much more serious than previous, so I ask for your patience. Western civilization is fundamentally based on the 10 commandments of God. I think we don't need to count them here. But in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, however, it is stated that the precondition for establishing a classless society of equality is the breakdown of the key foundations of the Western civilizations. This involves the breakdown or destruction of the family, nation, private property, religion, and private education. At the same time, the abolition of representative democracy and the establishment of the rule by the people. Following the instructions of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, the implementation of the manifesto began with revolutionary terror, as they described this attempt by themselves. In a good part of the planet, a communist dictatorship was established by violence. Because there were no realistic conditions for a violent seizure of power in some more developed environments in the Northern and Western Europe and America, individual advocates of Marxism conceived a different path for breaking down the foundation of Western civilization. They called it cultural Marxism. In terms of values, cultural Marxism represents a culture of death. In technical terms, it is a formula. First discredit, then liquidate. According to their plan, it is necessary to first occupy the institutions that shape human values and then devalue the five fundaments of Western civilization. This is the family, nation, religion, private property, and private education. When these values are sufficiently discredited, most of the population will no longer defend them. As Antonio Gramsci wrote, newspapers, publishers, universities, and cultural institutions must first be occupied. In the century after Gramsci, technological and general development automatically added radio, film, television, and of course social media on this list, Among the institutions that need to be specifically occupied and controlled, all international or multinational organizations have been added. Various factions of the culture of that, especially corporate socialism or fascism, international and national socialism have chosen partly different emphasis and ways of destroying the foundation of Western civilization, but all have attacked its essence, its spiritual dimension, that is religion. The factions of corporate fascism and national socialism were dismantled at the end of the Second World War. Marxism, in the dimension of the international socialism, even strengthened territorially until the end of the Cold War, when it seemed to collapse. In fact, it only fully transformed into cultural Marxism. Slovenian communists described this transition by claiming that the Berlin Wall fell on both sides. Cuban communists responded by founding the Sao Paulo Forum, which today controls the majority of Latin America. Former working class or proletariat, as the carrier of progress according to Marxist believers, has gradually been replaced by all those social categories that can be justifiably or manipulatively labeled as minority, underprivileged, or oppressed. The classical Marxist goal, once openly named socialism as a world process, has been masked in more neutrally sounding humanitarian, social, or environmental global goals. Uniform formations with swastikas or red stars on their caps have been replaced by urban Antifa, awakened groups and individuals, and numerous other leftist so-called non-governmental organizations that are supposed to represent all oppressed and minority categories in society. Wherever leftists have access to public funds, they massively finance the so-called modern civil society. Organizations that invent all sorts of things to achieve the goals of cultural Marxism, invent gender theory, special LGBTQ human rights, summarize justifications for euthanasia like Hitler did, invent new social or racial injustice and their alleged victims every day. These groups were not elected by anyone and have no contribution to the common good. But they receive incredibly rich financial injections from state budgets of various domestic or foreign foundations. In Latin America, they are also heavily funded by drug cartels. Leftists finance hundreds of various civil initiatives, quasi-institutes, and quasi-cultural events that serve to discredit the foundation of Western civilization. Often also as a political army that organizes street protests and violence when the left is not in power. The rules of the pre-election campaign do not apply to them. There is usually no control over the expenditure of money for their political struggle. Even more, many such associations are also richly funded from the EU funds, while some European and other international conventions grant them a special status in the decision-making process. In this way, alongside classic political and multinational organizations and corporations, a special supportive structure of cultural Marxism is established and financially supported, which no one has elected. They usually call themselves the voice of the people. The most important role of the unelected is in many cases the destruction of the culture of life. That is everything that represents the real traditional social capital of a community. We must take this strict rule of the unelected seriously, as it deliberately weakens or even destroys representative democracy. And this is the strategic goal of cultural Marxism. Free elections in an environment where basic political freedoms, especially freedom of speech, free economic initiative and equal rules for all are central problem for cultural Marxism. For many people in former communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe, it is incomprehensible, difficult to understand that a large part of the financial support for the extreme left or destructive interventions of cultural Marxism comes from the capitalist West. However, this financial support is not so illogical, and it is not based solely on the common denial of the spiritual dimension of man. Because an individual without strong emotional ties to their environment, for instance, family, local community, nation, and moral values, is the logical meeting point between cultural Marxism and political globalism. Both prefer a pliable and spendthrift consumer, a person without attachment to home, local community and nation, a person without oikophilia, as Sir Roger Scruton would say. A person who is only connected to the virtual network and their screens. A consumer who they can access directly without formal, for instance, national and moral barriers. At the same time, there is nothing better for a financial speculator like George Soros that a spendthrift socialist government that borrows heavily and whose taxpayers then pay high interest rates. With the extremely dangerous and frighteningly successful march of cultural Marxism through our civilization, instead of an increasingly free, relaxed, and orderly environment for the individual, we get a semblance of freedom, in which freedom is what the unelected label as freedom. Whoever refuses to be blinded or refuses to submit becomes a problem. If they speak out loudly, they are accused of hate speech. They are publicly persecuted and discredited. If they try to connect with others who do not accept the illusion, they are declared fascists. If they resist, the so-called independent, unelected judiciary in many countries persecutes and suppresses them. Western civilization, dear friends, is not under attack from some other, more advanced culture. It is under attack from structures that want to destroy it, but do not offer an alternative. Only its illusion, which then, when we unveil the veil of cultural Marxist illusions, reveals the socialist chaos of today's Cuba or Venezuela. And we are not witnessing a clash of civilizations, but a barbaric attack on civilization. We are witnessing an attack by the culture of death on the culture of life. An attack that is far from a clash of two equally powerful sides, but a brutal conquering march of the culture of death through the values of Western civilization. So far, we have to admit, it has been very successful because of mainly three reasons. First, because it was skillfully disguised by the perversion of concepts, so that the central discourse today, language, no longer describes the reality. Language no longer describes the reality. Because the culture of that, or cultural Marxism, was sold, wrapped in the cloak of liberalism, human rights, and environmental protection. And because it has been globally led and financed. The conquering campaign of the culture of death through Western civilization was very successful also because the destructive power of the culture of death was underestimated and the resistance was insufficiently organized. One of the essential initial mistakes of this resistance was the repetition of the fallacy of the beginnings of the classical Marxism, according to which material conditions themselves would change people's consciousness. Many individuals from the camp of the culture of life, from the conservative side, believe that the economy, the forum of liberal democracy, and technology would, by themselves, deal with the fallacies of cultural Marxism. Of course, this did not happen. On the contrary, wealth produced or created precisely due to the conservative values, life forces and evolutionary abilities of modern capitalism were abused in many places to destroy its foundation. And this even though classical conservative philosophers and thinkers warned of the dangers of the cultural Marxism from the very beginning. Unfortunately, their ideas were not followed by an effective organization at the national and international level quickly and strongly enough. today, if we are really frank. Within the framework of the Western civilization circle, we have only one country that openly and fully resists this danger, and this is Hungary. And one international political organization, CPAC, which fully realizes that the values of the Western civilizations, its fundamental rights, must be defended where they are actually under attack. Dear friends, in the Holy Bible, in the Gospel of John, we read, in the beginning, it was the Word, and the Word was with God. All things were made through Word, and without it, it was not anything made that was made. Therefore, we must regain the Word. We must regain the language that will describe reality. We must name things and phenomena for what they are. We must regain a full freedom of speech. We must regain the autonomy of the family and the sovereignty of the nation. We must regain schools where there is no place for cultural Marxism and the culture of that. We must regain sufficient space in universities, publishing houses, media, cultural institutions, and social networks. We must regain democracy that will be the rule of voters and the elected. Thank you all who were among the first to resist the destructive campaign of the culture of death publicly and bravely. The masks have fallen. The real fight begins. As Victor said yesterday, Reconquista, and the culture of life will prevail. God bless you all.